thank you so much everyone for coming, you know, on this warm and balmy evening when frankly you should be in a pub garden somewhere probably. And it's so nice to see some familiar names as well, some of you from far-flung places of the world, so thank you. It's really nice to see you, or hopefully we'll see you at some point. So just a kind of warning before we start, this talk is about human bones, so I will be showing photographs of human skeletons. Okay, so obviously I'm the person giving the talk, but I think it's worth pointing out at the start that with most of these research projects, they involve a cast of thousands. So I have a large number of co-authors as well. Right, so I specialise in the study of human skeletal remains from archaeological sites, and my interest in these is not really in the sense of medical specimens or anything like that. As an archaeologist, what we want to do is look at these skeletons and see what they can tell us about the way that people lived in the past. So we're trying to use the skeletal remains to find out about different aspects of past lives. Now the skeleton in ourselves or in living people is a dynamic living tissue, so it's not this inert substance which people often think. So it interacts with our physical and our social environment in a dynamic way, and this is great for us because our job is to look at all of these really subtle changes in the skeleton to see and trying to interpret that in terms of different activities, diets, lifestyles, and so on. Now, one of the things that I'm really interested in is looking at the skeleton, seeing what it can tell us about different aspects of social identity. So I've got some categories of social identity here, obviously not exhaustive, but the categories that I'm going to focus on today is social class and age. So another really interesting thing about the skeleton, which makes it such an important and valuable source of archaeological evidence, is that it doesn't just provide us with a snapshot of a person's life at the time of death. Instead, it has this real biographical power. And this is because different tissues and the different teeth are forming at different ages and remodeling to different timescales. And so we can use this to try and construct a biography of someone's life. So if you see on this slide here, you can see this spongy bone here. That remodels quite quickly and so might give us some information for the last, say, 5 years of a person's life. Whereas if we were to sample this compact bone on the outside, that remodels much more slowly, so maybe would give us pooled data for the last, say, 20 years. Now this is the dentition of a child of about 6 years of age. The first permanent molar is just starting to erupt. Now, even in an adult individual, we would have all these teeth you can see are forming in the jaw, but these are obviously retained into adulthood. So if I were to have an adult skeleton, I can still find out things about that person as a child when those teeth were developing. So again, even in adult remains, we can find out information about their much earlier life. If we were to sample these deciduous, these milk teeth, these could even give us information about that child as they were developing in utero. So that is then going to provide us with some intergenerational information about maternal health, for example. So when we're looking at skeletons, we're thinking about different timescales. We're thinking about the biographies of the individuals. We're thinking about intergenerational timescales, and even, you know, evolutionary timescales. Some of my colleagues focus on. Now, this talk is going to focus on children. For a long time, children have really been neglected, generally in archaeological studies, but even in bioarchaeology. And generally, the feeling is they're not preserved very well, they're underrepresented at cemetery sites. But actually, these are really important individuals for finding out about overall population health. And this is because the skeleton, the growing skeleton, is really sensitive to environments or adverse social conditions. So they've been described as the canaries in the coal mine in terms of overall population health. So for us, the skeletal remains of children are a really invaluable source of evidence for finding out about what was happening in past societies. Now, my research has focused on all different periods, mostly in the UK, a lot on the Roman period, but I've always been fascinated with the 18th and 19th century, and in particular, this period of rapid industrialisation and the effects of this on the bodies of children who were living and working during this time. Now, as we all know, we all learn at school, this is a period of really rapid urbanisation. So you go from a primarily rural workforce, and then with the industry, these towns spring up very quickly, often with not proper infrastructure in place, proper sanitation or good water supplies. We know that people flock into these towns. They're often living in overcrowded, dark, dingy, insanitary housing. And so the conditions that many of the working poor were living in during this time were actually quite dire. For the children of the poor will always have worked, even prior to this period, and about half of the population of Britain during this time was under 20 years of age. So children would have been working perhaps in the fields or in the home, but what changed with the Industrial Revolution was really the nature of that work. So children going out to work in a kind of factory setting or coal mines and so on. By around the mid-19th century, there was a real concern about the impact of this on the bodies of children. So contemporary social commentators were seeing that the children were very short for their age, they were very pale, they had lank hair, they were quite lethargic, there's spinal curvatures, rickets, you name it. So there was a concern then about what these working conditions and the urban environments were having on these children, and actually ultimately for the overall population health. There's a quote here by Francis Sharp, who is a physician, and he worked in Scarborough initially in a kind of fairly rural setting and then moved to Leeds. And what he noticed, and I'll just read the quote, is that I was at once struck by the fact that the general appearance of the children, this is in Leeds, was much paler and their fibre less vigorous. I saw too that many children were exceptionally small for their age, and if people from the country were not constantly coming in, the race of mill hands would soon be wholly degenerate. So there's very much this idea at the time that children in the countryside were kind of all rosy-cheeked and healthier and taller, and children in the urban areas, and certainly those working in factories, were stunted and pale. There's a lot of debate about this from historians, and in more recent years there's kind of been revisions that have moved towards this idea that actually factory work wasn't that bad, you know, and the children were contributing economically, and it wasn't quite as bad as we might think. So one of the things that I wanted to do was look into this. Are we seeing a difference between the rural and urban environments in health? And I was really fortunate that two collections of skeletal remains came to our department about 10 years ago now. The first was from a rural site, which is actually really unusual because most of our excavations are happening in urban areas, and that's because that's where the development is happening. So there's definitely an urban bias in the kind of data that we had. So this rural site was really unusual. Most of the skeletons were around 19th century, but that provided a really unique rural perspective of this period. And then we had an urban collection from North Shields, site of Coach Lane, which was actually a Quaker burial site, so a Society of Friends burial site, and they were roughly contemporary. So this is our rural site, the Fewston site, and it was a great site for many reasons. We also had some named individuals, which is incredibly useful for us, so we could then get census records, look at birth and death certificates, things like that. But really exceptionally at this site, we had diaries of a 19th century resident who lived in the area at this time. And actually these diaries were a fascinating insight into everyday life. And he even mentions some of our named individuals in his diaries. So we have a child called Roland Margerison who died at about 1 year of age. And he describes, John Dickinson in his diaries describes Roland's funeral which is really, you know, for me, I never have this kind of experience when I'm looking at Roman skeletons, so this was really fascinating. And actually it's really poignant because Roland's family hired this guy with a carriage to transport the coffin, and the guy gets drunk in a pub, and you know, it's a kind of pretty grim story. The other thing that was really exciting about this project is that we had living descendants of the known individuals who worked with us as well, and that was really great in terms of it really helped with our interpretation of the archaeological evidence too. This is the Coach Lane site, so this is the North Shields cemetery. Now, during this period, obviously fishing's big industry here, but there was all kinds of manufacturing going on in North Shields at this time. So actually, when you get descriptions for this period, it's quite polluted and insanitary and all the rest of it. That's often how it's described. This was a Quaker cemetery, some middle class people here, but a real mix in terms of social classes. So these were the aims then, to kind of compare and contrast the impact of urban and rural environments on the health of children, to look at the effects of poverty and child labour on the growing body. But I was also interested in the role of occupational and poverty-related diseases for the construction of working class embodied identities. So how were these people viewed, and how did these impacts of their working conditions affect the way that people viewed them? So first, just focusing on the age at death. So we've got Fewston at the top, Coach Lane at the bottom, and this is just the ages of the children at the site. So, well, those less than 20. And what you'll see is there's a real stark contrast between the two. The Fewston site has a really high proportion of adolescents. Now, this is very unusual in terms of a mortality profile from an archaeological cemetery assemblage. Usually you have much higher proportion of children under 6 years of age, which is what we've got here. Now, archaeological cemetery assemblages, no, not perfect by a long way. You know, quite often infants, we know infant mortality is really high during this period, and that's always underrepresented at these sites. But the takeaway message from this is that Fewston, bit weird in terms of its mortality, far too many adolescents, and I'll get onto that a bit more later on. So we also looked at a range of metabolic diseases, so things like rickets, vitamin D deficiency, scurvy, and something called cribra orbitea, which usually refers to a kind of non-specific sort of anemia. Now, in the Northeast during this time, the British Medical Association did a survey a bit later on than these sites, sort of in the 19th century, and showed that rickets was, or the Northeast was a real focal zone for rickets. And the levels of rickets are really high during this period, and we can see that reflected in this figure here. Now, what was interesting to us is that our assumption would naturally be that in the rural site, Fewston, there would be much lower levels of these deficiency diseases than we would see in the urban site, and that would fit with historical narratives. So the fact that this was not the picture that we were getting from the skeletal evidence was really interesting. So this photograph here, I'm just showing you, you see these bowed femora, the thigh bones, and you can see this is an example of what rickets might look like. And rickets was known as one of the most important hidden diseases of the 19th century. Now, obviously it has very visible signs, but it was called hidden because it often didn't feature on mortality, bills of mortality as a cause of death. It was an underlying cause, but it was often not actually listed as the cause. But you can see these very distinctive changes. So on this photograph of this young boy here, you can see that he has this sort of squared off appearance to his skull. You can see this bowing of his arm bones, and his wrists look swollen, and that's because the ends of the bones flare out. They're trying to grow, they're laying down the organic bit, but the bones are just not getting properly mineralized. This is a young girl that has rickets, as you can see. So this is from the 19th century. She's actually 11 years of age. She looks much younger, and she's likely to have been very short for her age. So these are some tibia, some leg bones as well. So these bones here, and you can see how they're bowed and bending outwards, much like they are in this young girl. And again, you can see how the ends of the bones are very flared out, and they look swollen, and you can see the twisting of her limbs. She actually does get better. The reason that she was photographed for the medical journal was because it's actually quite a late age to show such severe rickets. Usually it's much younger children. The other thing that we saw a lot of at these sites is something called knock-knees. So where you get this twisting or torsion of the tibia and the femora to create this knock-kneed appearance. And this is something, again, that was noted in the factory inquiries by the same physician that I mentioned earlier, Francis Sharp. So he describes this peculiar twisting of the lower parts of the thigh bones. And he says this is something that he sees in the adolescents. Now, he thinks it's due to the ergonomic demands of factory work, but actually it's this underlying vitamin D deficiency. So it's not just the labour per se. The other thing, as you saw from the earlier bar chart, that we're seeing a lot of is things like scurvy, so vitamin C deficiency. So we're generally seeing all-round nutritional deficiencies. Vitamin D deficiency is more related to sunlight. So we think about, for example, air pollution, maybe children staying inside for long hours, not getting out in the sunshine. That's probably a more likely cause of the vitamin D that we're seeing during the 19th century. But vitamin C deficiency is dietary related, and we do see signs of this on the skeleton. Now, this can lead to things like lethargy, you get pains in the joints, you might get bleeding. But can also, it can also affect cognition as well, and the immune system. Vitamin D deficiency can affect the immune system too, and there's been a lot written about that over this last year in relation to COVID. The other thing that we're seeing at both of these sites is that growth is really severely affected. So at Fewston, there's 3 children that are about 16 to 18 years of age, but they're the size of 9 to 10-year-olds. I've got this photo just because it's a really nice illustration, but it's actually from a site in Leeds of a similar period where we had 8 to 10-year-olds that were the size of 3 to 5-year-olds, so massive growth stunting. These are 2 children that are the same age, but you can see this is from a medieval site and this is from the 19th century site. So you can see the massive effect it's having on children's growth. We don't like to just look at the length of the bones, we can also look at the thickness of the bones, of the bone cortex. And in fact, in many ways, that's a more sensitive indicator of stress than the length. And what we're seeing is, again, really thin bones that are much thinner than they should be, again, indicating some kind of deficiencies. And we were seeing this in both of the sites. We also looked at vertebral growth, which tends not to be looked at quite so often. And again, what you can see is the Fewston site, surprisingly, these are teenagers from the Fewston site, and you can see just how short they were, even compared to the Coach Lane site, the urban site. And actually, when you look at these skeletons, you can see all kinds of other pathologies related to deficiencies. Another useful skeletal indicator of deficiencies are the teeth. So we see these defects, enamel defects in the teeth. Now these occur if there's some kind of period of stress. The teeth will stop forming and then they'll kind of restart. And usually you end up with lines in the enamel of the teeth. But here you can see that the defects are a little bit more extreme. You've got all these kind of pitting defects. Now what's interesting here, so this is the teeth from the same individual, and you've got a mixture here of milk teeth, the deciduous teeth, and you've got the permanent teeth. And you're seeing defects on all of them. So you're seeing them on the deciduous teeth and the permanent teeth. So this is, whatever's affecting this child isn't some kind of one-off thing. It's something that's prolonged. It's happening over a period of years. And in fact, the fact that we're getting defects even on the deciduous teeth may signal that there's in utero stress, because these teeth actually start to form while the fetus is developing in utero. Obviously, they don't start to erupt until 6 months of age, but they're forming in the jaw. So we saw very high levels of dental defects as well, and quite extreme looking dental defects. So these defects, as I said, some of them pointing to poor maternal health. Now, we know that any kind of adversity that's affecting the mother can impact on the infant, and the severity of that in terms of lifelong consequences will vary depending on the gestational age at which the infant has been affected. But if we're talking about chronic poverty, chronic deficiency in the mother, then that is going to have consequences for the infant, to the extent where it will also predispose the infant to infectious diseases and chronic diseases later in life. And this is quite an important point. So recently there's been a fair amount of work on something called the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis. And within this, it states that the first 1,000 days of life, and that's from conception, not from birth, is really important in terms of later life health risks. So what happens to us early on in life during that really sensitive developmental period when the skeleton is quite plastic, that is really significant in terms of lifelong health. But also beyond that, what this hypothesis is telling us as well is that we need to think about health in intergenerational terms. So poor health actually arises from really an accumulation of risk potentially across generations rather than a single life course. For us as bioarchaeologists, this is really important because we tend often just to interpret pathologies in terms of immediate proximate causes, but actually we might need to think about them more long term. So for example, growth of children really tracks the maternal phenotype, so maternal growth as well, and that will relate to her own childhood. So we need to start going back a little bit. Likewise, if we think about famine events, okay, they might be a kind of one-off event, but they might then have health consequences that go on for a couple of generations more, if not further than that. Okay, so we've got a pattern then that's emerged from this. There are too many adolescents at Fewston. It's really weird. And the Fewston kids are way more unhealthy than we thought they would be. They're actually worse than the urban kids. And this doesn't fit at all with the picture that we're getting from the historical evidence. So what's going on? Well, Fewston had a mill. So we have to think also about rural industry. The industry isn't just located in the urban centres, there's rural mills during this time. One of the volunteers who was working on the Fewston project looked at the parish burial records between 1783 and 1864. And what she found was this increase in adolescent deaths during the time that the mill was in operation. So if we go back to the beginning in 1783, what you're seeing throughout is really high levels of death in the under-twos, and that's exactly what you would expect. We know that infant mortality is really high. And you've got fairly low adolescent deaths. So if we look at the black bars of the adolescents. But then as the mill starts to come into operation, and here it is at its height, the adolescent deaths are going through the roof. And we know that a lot of the adolescents are dying with the address of Westhouse Mill. So these were children that were working in the mill. We also know from looking at the historical records that some of these apprentices to the mill were actually supplied by workhouses in cities like London. So the parishes of Lambeth and Shoreditch were supplying children to work in the mills in the north. Now, what they would do is the children would sign an indenture, and they would then be taken up quite often in batches from the workhouses to work in these mills. They didn't know where they were. Their parents didn't really have a great deal of say in it, if their parents were even alive. It was great for the workhouses and the parishes because they didn't have to pay for the upkeep of the children. They could kind of relinquish them. And so these children were apprenticed from as young as 7 years of age. Most for the Fewston mill were older, between about 10 and 13 years. And this table here shows where some of these children were coming from. Now, we have a quote from someone who actually worked in the mill at Fewston as a kid. So this guy, Robert Collier, now he wasn't a pauper apprentice himself. He was a local kid, but his parents had been pauper apprentices and had met at the mill, had Robert, and then he himself had to go and work in the mill. So he describes conditions there as really poor. You know, they're working 14 hours a day, they're beaten for any sort of transgressions, and some of the children are really struggling. Now we have an account as well from a pauper apprentice. He didn't work at the Fewston mill, but he was in the workhouse at St Pancras in London, and he was taken at the age of 7 to work in a cotton mill in Nottingham. He ran away from it. It was horrible. So he was persuaded to go up and sign his indenture because he was promised plenty of roast beef and plum pudding and cash. Obviously, when he got there, it was more like porridge and black bread. He lost a finger, or part of a finger, during the work. One of his friends was scalped by some of the machinery. He tried to run away, but they get returned. And then when that mill closed down, he got sent to another mill. So it's really a kind of exploitative relationship here. They've got these children. There's no one that really cares about them. They've got no family nearby. And they're just basically abandoned to work in the mills. And really, they're at the mercy of the mill owners and just how, you know, whether they're good to them or not. So it's a really exploitative relationship. So Robert Blinco talks about various traumas that the children underwent, and we do have an account of someone who had an accident at the Fewston mill. I think they lost a part of an arm. But we didn't see any evidence of that in the Fewston skeletons that we looked at, but the preservation wasn't great. Here, though, is the skull of one of the children from the urban site, the Coach Lane site. And what you can see is, it's hard to make out because it's damaged, but you've got this radiating fracture line here. And actually, there was trauma when we pieced it together properly. You could see some trauma here. So this is a child who's been whacked on the head, or as something's fallen on them. And actually, there has been some attempt at medical intervention. So here, this nice neat circle here is actually a trepanation. So this is what they've tried to do to save the child's life. We can see that the edges of these lesions are really sharp. So this medical intervention didn't work, and unfortunately, the child died. So getting back to our Fewston kids, so we wanted to look to see if they had any other pathologies that might have indicated that these were definitely children who worked in the mill, that these were teenagers who died in the mill. So one of the things that we know is an occupational hazard of mill work is respiratory problems, bisonosis. They're inhaling these cotton particles all the time, and that's causing them all kinds of respiratory problems in their lungs, but also their upper respiratory system. And so we saw very high levels of respiratory disease in these Fewston kids, which again ties in with this idea that they were mill workers. This here is a child, very fragmented skeleton, unfortunately, but you can see this large hole is actually in the eye socket, and then other similar lesions on the cranium and elsewhere. And this looks very much like it's tuberculosis. So again, we wanted to take a kind of closer look at the skeletons, again, to see whether these children could have been those who were taken from workhouses in cities elsewhere. Now, the fact that we have named individuals really helped us here, because we know these orange squares are people who lived and worked, were born in the local area. So that's a real luxury for us from an archaeological perspective to get that information. And then when we looked at the isotope ratios in the teeth of the children, and what these do is tell us a little bit of information about where the children grew up, where they were when their teeth were forming, because that changes the sort of chemical ratio in the teeth. And what we can see is that a lot of these adolescent skeletons, so this is the one with the tuberculosis, are separating out, which very much looks like they're not local to the area. And actually a lot of these values are consistent with the values we'd expect from London. Daniel Fox here is an interesting chap. He's not local either. He was actually an Irish policeman who died and was buried at the cemetery. We've also got some adolescents up here with very different values. So they're not from London. So what this suggests to us is that actually the apprentices were not all brought from the same place. Some were brought in from other parts of the country as well. I'm not quite sure where these values relate to yet. So I'm just checking the time. In the 19th century, the working class were really regarded as biologically as well as socially inferior. So when we think, how could they have treated these children this way? This is really awful. It's because they were almost seen to be a separate species. They were inferior. They were inherently inferior. And obviously their working conditions and their food, their poor diet, that had a real impact on their bodies, but that just fed into these ideas that they were naturally inferior. And things like this fueled notions of social Darwinism and class eugenics. And when you look at accounts of the relationship between occupation and health during this time, you see there's so many occupational ailments. And in fact, there's an account of someone who's going to church and he says that he can pick out which job individuals within the church do just from the way they look, you know, whether they've got, you know, a cough or whether they've got, you know, greenish tint to their hair or whatever, which is really interesting. One of the other pathologies that we saw, this time at the urban site, that might directly link to an occupation is something called phosphorus necrosis, so Phossy Jaw. And this is something that's been associated with the matchmaking industry. So here we have a child, it's actually a boy who's 12 to 14 years of age, and you see this massive hole in the jaw. That's not damage that's happened in the ground, this is actually destruction that was happening during life. And this is basically the dead bit of bone that was in that sort of hole in the jaw. So we compared this to some examples of Phossy Jaw held at the Royal College of Surgeons, and it certainly seems to fit in. So that might suggest this individual worked at a matchmaking factory. Phosphorus was in other stuff though, like medicine as well. So it's possible that it was medicine for something else. We can't be 100% sure. We know that there were a lot of match factories springing up around the 19th century. And what Phossy Jaw is a really nasty thing. You get to start off with toothache and then you get a sore and it would be, you know, oozing and really smelly. A lot of the accounts of people with it actually talk a lot about the smell, which is really interesting from my perspective because it's not something that I think about very often. So we should perhaps think a little bit more about smell and stigmatization when we're looking at diseases. But interesting, because it's phosphorus, it also causes, like, you get like luminous breath, you get like luminous, you know, hair and clothes. And there are accounts of grandchildren of those involved in the match workers strike in the 19th century, and they say they remember seeing pools of luminous vomit in the streets near the matchmaking factories. So a really disfiguring and stigmatizing disease, and especially with match factories, it was the poorest of the poor who worked in them, quite often children and women, and they really didn't earn very much at all, and their poor conditions led to the very famous match girls strike in 1888. And what's interesting is when you read accounts of the matched girl strike, again, they talk about the physicality of the poor, how they're undersized and pale next to the sort of middle class women who were advocating for them. So really, so I'm close to wrapping up. Really, the kind of story of these children really is one of, I think, power and violence. If we're thinking about these children who were born into workhouses, we're talking about intergenerational poverty at these times. So really the odds were stacked against these children before they'd even you know, had their first breath. So they were born into kind of social disadvantage, obviously, but they carried with them an accumulation of health risk from previous generations as well. And then, you know, by some miracle, they were able to survive infancy, but then were sent to work in factories in the north, with no one really looking out for them. They really were viewed as expendable. And you know, we can see the effects of all of this on their bodies. So hugely stunted growth, all kinds of deficiency diseases. With some of these kids, you're just kind of in wonder that they lived as long as they did, quite frankly. So these really fragile bodies were very soon kind of devoured by the Victorian industrial machine. So just to conclude then, we can see these lots of deficiency diseases, poor growth and low life expectancy in the 18th and 19th century, because that social status becomes enmeshed within the biological fabric of the body. And actually, you know, social status is one of the strongest determinants of health today. So we see really stark differences in life expectancy between the richest and poorest within the UK. So this is not something that's completely gone away. But in the 19th century, certainly a person's social inferiority was thought to be written on their body, and their moral character was also seen to be deficient. So poverty during this time was almost like thought of as a contagion. So it, you know, rather than the fact that it's these inequitable social structures that are actually subjugating the working poor. And as I've said, these kind of really compromised physiologies really reinforce this perception of them as somehow degenerate. So as I've also discussed, extreme poverty is known to result in these kind of heritable biological consequences via poor maternal health status that we need to think about. And, you know, this is going to exacerbate those mortality risks as well, which meant that really only the very tenacious could survive and thrive. Now, I'm not saying that people couldn't get out of that poverty trap. They clearly did. Individuals were able to exercise some agency within this, but they were operating within some very severe constraints. Now, what's interesting for this period is that, like, paradoxically, it was a period when childhood was considered to be a kind of a state of innocence and of nature. So it's like, well, how do you square that with the conditions that some of these and treatment of some of these children? But actually, the children of the poor weren't subject to the same kind of moral censor as their parents. Who were kind of generally regarded as kind of lazy and feckless in some way. So the children then had this kind of veneer of blamelessness. So as a consequence of that, actually, it was the damaged bodies of these children which then became this powerful symbol of social injustice and really helped to precipitate some of the social changes that happened later on in that century. So they're kind of broken bodies, if you like, were able to articulate this kind of injustice and became this catalyst for social change ultimately. So I'll finish there, but here are some of the names of some of these pauper apprentices from Fewston. We felt as part of the project that it was really important that these children had their names back, and the volunteers that were involved in this project produced a number of artistic outputs as well to kind of commemorate the lives of these children. And actually we all got a little bit emotionally involved as well. So just some acknowledgements here. And as this is going to be recorded, I'm going to stick up a bit of reading here for any students or anyone who's interested. And that's it, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now, David, is that okay?
This is the awkward bit where we all ought to be applauding you, but we can't. So you'll have to imagine lots of people clapping here.
Oh my God, it's so loud, it's rapture.
So thank you very much, Becky. I mean, that was a fascinating and I think quite sobering account of the impact of industrialisation. I think also it shows a couple of things. It shows the potential for archaeology, which I think we perhaps know as archaeologists, but the wider public may not know, to engage in some really important questions about actually trying to understand and unpick the big impacts of some of these major social processes over time. And also it shows, I think, the value of archaeology for looking at the more recent past as well. I think often people they're quite comfortable with archaeologists looking at prehistory or the Romans, but forget that actually we can use archaeological techniques to look at the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. So thank you very much. I imagine there's going to be lots of questions, so if people want to pop questions into the chat bar, I will do my kind of compare my Bruce Forsyth, and I will deploy the questions. So we've got a question from Bob. When did the idea that working class as a sub-race start to alter? And was the First World War an important breakpoint?
So I think that's really interesting. I don't think it has altered entirely. I think if you look at the rhetoric that politicians are using today to describe those getting benefits, it's not actually dissimilar. I'm seeing a lot of echoes. This idea of the undeserving poor, which I think Margaret Thatcher reintroduced, was something that was around in the mid-1830s, and that was around the time there was a change in the poor laws to make them more punitive. So they really wanted to punish the poor at that time. They were, the undeserving poor. And I guess, I think that the wars are in many ways start to really instigate profound social change. So I think you're right with this link to the war as a breaking point. Certainly the Second World War, I think the First World War did a lot to dismantle some of the kind of elite structures, but I think the Second World War probably. What's really interesting though is the impact of the Boer War. So if we think about the 1899 with they couldn't get recruits. So about a third of working class people failed the medicals of the volunteers to sign up for the war, failed the medical because they were in such a woeful physical state. And that really prompted some alarm. People were thinking, oh my God, there's a physical deterioration of the nation. So they instigated a committee to look into this. And then I think the committee found that actually it's okay, it's just poor people. And it's their fault, it's because they don't eat properly, and it's because they don't work hard enough, and they're really filthy in their habits, so it's their fault. So it's really interesting seeing that. But obviously around that turn of the century as well, you're getting these eugenic ideas are really powerful in the early 1900s as well. So these, again, feeding into this idea that there was this inferiority. So in England, eugenics was really along class lines. I think in the United States, probably more along race lines, maybe. But that was stemmed from this idea of inferior classes. So there was another concern that it was the poor that were having all the children, and the right sort of people, the middle and upper classes, were not having enough children. So again, part of that kind of those sort of eugenic ways of thinking. I hope that's a rambling answer, sorry.
That's excellent. I just want to come in there because we for a project I ran, we looked at the impact of the Great Depression on the landscape and the people of the Northeast. So this is the late 20s and 30s, and were a series of work camps were set up for ostensibly to train people in the skills they'd need to get jobs. But when you look at the archive material for these work camps, there's a huge amount of concern about what food they were eating, and a kind of an obsession with weighing people and how much they weighed when they came in, how much they weighed when they came out. And again, a lot of it was the same kind of subtext about building people up, making them stronger. And yes, they needed skills to face a new industrial world and the looming war, but also a lot of it was about food. But there were equally there were riots in at least one of the work camps because the food was so poor. So sometimes what the aspiration was and what actually happened didn't always gel. So are there, and sorry, go on. You
No, I
can
was
say
just going
something
to say
fascinating.
it's really interesting to hear. And I remember reading The Road to Wigan Pier, George Orwell, and that was really, it's a good read. And I like, because he's talking about coal miners as well, and he actually goes into a coal mine, but he's quite scathing about the food that the poorer people are eating. He said they're eating too much jam and bread. They're not eating enough things that have nutrition, and he's quite scathing about that. But I imagine it's for the similar reasons as today. You know, sugar is cheap around that time. It starts to become really cheap, and we see that in. I didn't talk about the dental disease too much, but we see that in the teeth of children from the 19th century as well. They're eating a lot of sugar, and their teeth are just wrecked as a result. But it's interesting when you read just how you know, scathing people are of that. And it's not dissimilar today. You know, if you go to Sainsbury's, you can buy 4 donuts for £1 or an apple. You know, we know fruit and veg is expensive.
That's wonderful. Any other questions? There must be some questions there. You've blown everyone away.
I should say as well, I'm just filling the silence, in the factories as well. So when they were trying to enforce factory acts, which came later, I think they were only enforced in a very half-assed way, if I can say that. But they were initially looking at height, you know, so we need to say if they're at a minimum age, well, what height are they? But then they realized they couldn't really do that because they're all really short. It's really hard to kind of estimate age from height. So then they did start to look at the teeth as a way of saying whether the people were old enough to work in the factories.
Right, so we've got another question. So what sparked your interest in adolescent skeletal remains?
So,
Did you start with grown-up skeletal remains and move on to adolescent skeletal remains?
So, well, I've always been interested in, I don't know, it sounds a bit weird, I suppose, but in skeletal remains of children, purely because they're just so informative. Now, it's actually these specific adolescent remains that sparked my interest, and it's just because they really stuck out. It was weird that there were so many at Fewston, so that was a kind of what's going on here. And this is before we really knew about the mill or had really dug into the context of it all. So when we first got the assemblies, we were like, okay, that's really strange. And then the fact that these children didn't look like the locals, in the sense that they were really stunted and they had all these pathologies. So the locals that we saw, the named individuals, were kind of normal height. Yes, they had some pathologies, but nothing like we were seeing in these adolescents. Now, obviously, the adolescents are the ones who died, so there's that kind of survivor, non-survivor bias, but still, they looked weird. So that's what sparked, we just thought, hang on, we need to look into this, something's going on here. You know, thankfully, we had an amazing team of volunteers at the Washburn Heritage Centre who really were fantastic.
Well, we've got another question here from Bob, which was actually my backup question I was keeping in reserve in case we run out of questions. Do you have a fully rural site which actually shows poor rural children better?
Yeah, so we do have some kids who are local to Fewston as well. So they weren't, and we've got the adults that are still showing us about their childhood health to a degree. So I guess it was just different. There were different stressors. Now, certain, you know, we do see, and we hear about in the diaries. So, for example, in the diaries, they were talking about there was a big typhus epidemic, really ravaged the rural areas as well. A lot of the water was quite polluted. And there's this awful, there's a gravestone in the churchyard, and someone loses their 3 children in a week from typhus. Just unimaginable today. We know that there was whooping cough epidemics, you know, again going through the valley. So Roland Margerison, the 1-year-old kid that died, he died of whooping cough. So we don't have a purely rural, in that sense, not from this period. We do from other periods, certainly medieval and other periods, but not for this period, other than the locals that we have at this site. Sorry, I hope that's answered the question.
That's really interesting, because I mean I'm quite interested in what's going on in rural contexts in this period, and you get the great kind of agricultural depression from the 1870s to the end of the 19th century. And if you read a lot of rural writers, they are really emphasising how people are, well, they're living on credit, and again people are eating really bad food. Again, it's bread and marge and jam and tea and maybe cabbage and bacon if you're lucky.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see. I suppose the problem is though, we don't excavate rural cemeteries because they tend to be parish churches, and we can't.
The only reason this was excavated is because they were building a heritage centre on the side of the church. They would never, it just doesn't happen otherwise, does it? So we just have a real dearth of information about this. This assemblage has been reburied because it was Church of England, so it's been reburied. But yeah, we just don't have that. You know, we have, as archaeologists, we have our ideal samples in mind to address our questions, and then we have what actually is excavated, which is often quite a severe compromise.
I've got a couple more questions before we tie up. What future plans do you have for this collection? It seems a great opportunity for further comparisons.
Yeah, so Fewston, as I say, has been reburied now, which is, you know, a shame in many ways, but it was, you know, the project lives on in the sense that, in fact, we'll be presenting about the public archaeology component of that project at a conference in September. The Coach Lane collection is still in our labs, and we're doing a lot of additional research on it. So we've been doing lots of kind of fancier scientific techniques where we've been doing lots of chemical analysis, peptide analysis, and yeah, so there's so much you can do, and we've been taking a closer look at some of these deficiency diseases as well. We've got another site, Victoria Gate, which is from Leeds, only a small sample, about 20 individuals, but oh my god, they're fascinating. And actually, you know, they make the kids from Coach Lane look healthy, really in a bad way. So there's still lots of good work to be done, that's for sure.
So I've probably got one more question before we call it a day. A question from Ellen. In the adolescent deaths, did many relate to tuberculosis? I can't say it.
So there's only that one that we can say for sure. There is tuberculosis or possible tuberculosis in a couple of the adults, but that's the only one that we can be sure about, just from the skeletal changes. They were quite fragmentary, actually, a lot of them, unfortunately.
Oh, this is a really important thing, isn't it? The quality of human bone can vary wildly.
Yeah.
Depending how you...
Yeah, and it's always the most interesting skeletons that are the most fragmentary in the end.
One of the many paradoxes of archaeology. Well, thank you very much, Becky. That was really, really fascinating. I mean, there's lots of other comments there in the sidebar, but we haven't really got time. I just want to thank everybody for those questions, for coming on a horrible, hot, muggy evening. You're all allowed to go off your gin and tonics and beers and things now, or your non-alcoholic cups of tea. This lecture is recorded, and I will be putting it onto our YouTube channel soon. And I think through Eventbrite, I'll be able to send the link to everyone who's got a ticket for this, so I'll be able to listen to it again and again and again. So thank you very much, everybody. Final thing to say is we do have a couple of lectures next week. So next Tuesday, we've got our PhD student Sarah Steele talking about Whitby jet and how it's been interpreted in the past. And then next Wednesday, we have Richard Annis from Archaeological Services at Durham University talking about the work that our commercial unit at Durham does. You can find all the information about that on our durhamarchaeology.com webpage. So thank you very much. Thank you, Becky, and I'll see everybody soon.
Thanks for coming.
Cheers. Bye.